Networks to use attorneys as sources of information about their clients? I would say that this was a unique situation. Mr. Davidson was a unique situation, right? Eyes. And you are a sophisticated guy, right? Eyes. We can agree, you've had lawyers before, right? Yes, we just talked about some of them, right? Yes, and you had lawyers and you had meetings with the government %, correct? Yes. And you also worked with lawyers in situations that were less stressful? Eyes. On deals when you were making money, right? Right. And, generally speaking, you expected your lawyers not to provide information to third parties about what you discussed with them %3 be correct? Mr. Steinglass objection. The court sustained. QU expected confidentiality from your attorneys, correct? Mr. Steinglass objection. The court sustained. Q. So you said that Mr. Davidson was the only situation that AMI had where there was an attorney being used as a source, right? Not the only one, I don't know of other ones, but I'm sure there have been. So you don't know if there were any others other than Mr. Davidson? The only one that I know of was Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson knew Michael Cohen too, right? I found out that, yes, he did. I subsequently found that out afterwards. When you say afterwards, when did you learn that? It was probably right, previously before we signed the Karen McDougal agreement. So probably it was around August 5th or 6th. How did the agreement was signed in June? I'm sorry? No, I'm saying the first time I heard Keith the time Davidson's name was June 20th. To answer your question, the time that I heard about that he knew Michael Cohen, I didn't know that until around the end of July or early August. In June 2016, you learned that Dylan Howard was using an attorney as a major source of information for National Enquirer articles, correct? I wouldn't classify him as a major attorney. Exactly. What I am getting at is whether Mr. Davidson was a major source for Dylan Howard. We had hundreds of sources. He owned of many. You recall testifying in the grand jury with the district attorney, correct? Eyes. That was in 2023, right? Eyes. And just like in the federal grand jury, you were under oath, correct? Eyes. There was a court reporter there taking down your questions and your answers, right? Eyes. And do you recall describing during your testimony Mr. Davidson as one of your two major sources? One of two major sources for Dylan Howard. So he's a notan. Dylan Howard is one editor of 50, the editor-in-chief, but there are 50 several other, let me put it this way, several other editors all have their own sources. I don't know, when you take it down to those levels, that how many of them were attorneys, how many of them, how many times have they used that, I don't know that, I only heard that from Dylan. I understand, and that's what I was answering to. I appreciate the clarification, and I think that's fair. I'm not trying to stretch it. And no, I'm just trying to explain it. I appreciate that. And so Davidson was one of Dylan Howard's major sources, that's my point. That's correct. And he was also friends with Cohen, correct? Yes, and you didn't learn that Cohen-Davidson connection until right before the agreement was signed, right? That's correct. And you don't know what Cohen and Davidson were working on the side, do you? I don't. Mr. Bove, can we take a look at People's 161 in evidence, please? This is that invoice that we've looked at a couple of times, right? Yes, and this is not an AMI record, is it? No, it's not. And do you recall some questions on Tuesday about a thumb drive? Yes. Mr. Steinglass brought you a thumb drive and he asked you questions about documents on the thumb drive, right? Eyes. And you said, there are documents on this drive that I've reviewed, correct? Eyes. Objection. And said that these were all AMI records, correct? Mr. Steinglass, the court sustained. You testified on Tuesday that each document on the thumb drive weighs it was part of the business of AMI to make and keep these records. Right? That's correct. And that was a mistake with respect to this one, right? Mr. Steinglass objection. The court sustained. You just said this is not an AMI record, correct? That's correct. This is one of the documents that Mr. Rothstein prepared, right? Eyes. And he was not an employee when he prepared the invoice, right? No. And do you remember testifying yesterday that you saw this document around the time that it was prepared? Eyes. And that was a mistake too, right? Can you clarify that? You didn't actually see this document in 2016, did you? I saw the document when it did over for the billing to Cohen. When Rothstein was sending in 2016. I signed the original agreement and then, subsequently, the invoice was sent so I would have seen the invoice. Do you remember having a meeting in 2019 with the district attorney's office? Eyes. It was a long meeting, right? Yes. There were many questions, right? Yes. And there were many prosecutors, correct? Yes, it was a full room that day. Right? Eyes. You had your lawyers there too, right? Yes, and on the prosecution side, do you remember that somebody was typing? Eyes. Maybe more than one person, right? I don't remember that, I remember one person. One person was typing a lot, correct? Eyes. Do you recall that during that meeting, you told the prosecutors that the first time I saw this document was probably in 2017 when we were going through the document production for SDNY? Can I trouble you? Could I see that? Do you recall that? Yes. Mr. Bove, Mr. Bernick, this is for the parties, Mr. Pecker and the court, please. Defense A108. And, so, I want to start just by orienting you to look at the top, just the date and the participants. Eyes, I can see the top, I reviewed the top. MR Verbove, and now, if we could go to the page with Bates ending 061. Eyes. MR.Bove, and zoom in on the top half, please. And do you see the question says, why was it called a flat fee for advisory services by somebody named Walsh? Yes. And so that's a phrase from the invoice. Right? Yes, it is. And so at this part of the meeting you're being asked about the invoice, correct? Eyes. No, and do you see at the top of the page where you said, not in 2016. First time I saw this document was probably in 2017, when we were going through the document production for SDNY? Well, now seeing this, I clarified it too. Statement is correct. The statement in 2019 is correct? The statement in 2019 is correct. Thank you. That was the first time. And just so the record is clear, the mistake that was made is that you testified yesterday that you saw the invoice in 2016, right? Yes, I made an error. I would have seen it when what it says here. MR.Bove, we can take that down, please. And if we could bring up People's 180 in evidence. NIM, this is the Wall Street Journal article that we looked at earlier, right? Eyes. And it relates to Ms. McDougal, correct? And this is the one that came out before the election, eyes, right? Yes. And this article, it contains information about your agreement with Ms. McDougal. Correct? Eyes. As well as information about the story that she had told Dylan Howard, right? Eyes. It contains details about both of those issues, the agreement and the story? That's correct. And I think you testified yesterday that there was concerns about whether Ms. McDougal violated her agreement with AMI based on this article. Eyes. And you asked Dylan Howard to follow up with Keith Davidson, right? I did. Remember? And there was some text messages about that. Do you, Eyes, and do you remember that in the text messages Howard reported back that Ms. McDougal was cool and moving forward with the deal? Yes, and so as far as you knew, she didn't have any concerns about the content of her agreement with AMI prior to the election, right? That's correct. And that's what her attorney and Mr. Howard's source, Keith Davidson, were reporting to you, right? Yes, and this information, the agreement, AMI's agreement, and the underlying details that Ms. McDougal told to Dylan Howard were made public prior to the election? Eyes. MR.Bove, we can take this down, please. You also were asked some questions by Mr. Stanglass about Stormy Daniels. Do you remember those questions? I was asked some questions. And you testified that the first time that you heard about a potential article of Stormy Daniels was October 2016, right? That's correct. And you said that there was a phone call from Dylan Howard when he learned that? Eyes. Q, and I think you said you had dinner with your wife that night. That's correct. And you told Mr. Howard that you wanted no involvement with the story, correct? That is correct. And what you meant when you said no involvement with the story is I don't want AMI to be a part of this, right? Yes, and you did not consider the Stormy Daniels story to be a part of any agreement that you had in August 2015, correct? That's correct. You wanted nothing to do with it, right? That's right. And when you said that to Mr. Howard, you were still the chairman of AMI, right? Eyes. And the CEO%, correct? Yes, and the president, right? Yes, and you were speaking for the company, and for yourself? Yes. And a few weeks later, Mr. Howard told you that Ms. Daniels had not been paid, right? Eyes. And it's true, isn't it, that Keith Davidson is in the middle once again? Eyes. Inquiry, Mr. Howard was using an attorney as a source who was providing information from his client to the National Well, to Dylan Howard. To Dylan Howard, that's correct. Not to AMI, because you had not authorized Dylan Howard to be speaking with Davidson, correct? MR. Stanglass, objection. The court sustained. QI will break that up. You did not authorize Dylan Howard to speak to Keith Davidson about Stormy Daniels, correct? That's correct. So anything that Dylan Howard was doing with respect to Stormy Daniels was unauthorized and outside of his employment? MR. Stanglass, objection. The court sustained. When Mr. Howard came back to you on the Stormy Daniels story, what he said was Michael Cohen has not paid Keith Davidson. Right? And you were surprised to hear that? I was. I was surprised because you had told Howard to stay out of it, right? Correct, and, frankly, you were not happy to be hearing that, Eyes. Yes, and, at that point, when Howard contacted you about this payment, the main concern was Howard's reputation, right? Eyes, the concern was that Dylan Howard would look bad if this payment wasn't made, right? Eyes. And he said that to you, right? Eyes. He said it can't be that in this industry somebody promises to pay one of my sources and that doesn't happen, I look bad. That is correct. And so you and Howard called Mr. Cohen, right? Eyes. And you said to Mr. Cohen, I want you to know, I'm not paying or doing anything on this, right? Eyes, and you meant it? I did. AMI was not going to do anything on the Stormy Daniels story, correct? Eyes. You testified, I think, yesterday, about a meeting on January 6, 2017. Yes, and I think you said that that meeting happened at Trump Tower, right? That's correct. And I think you said that the reason that date sticks out to you is that there was very violent incident that day, right? The Eyes. At the Fort Lauderdale airport? Yes, I think 5 people died that day. Eyes. And then, obviously, there was a lot of coverage of that, right? Yes. And, so, in your memory, you sort of pegged it, the date of that meeting to that incident, right? And I think you said that on that day, January 6th, yes 2017, you were led into President Trump's office? Eyes. By Ms. Graff, Rona Graff? And that when you walked in, President Trump was sitting at his desk, right? And there was some people gathered around him, right? Correct. And what he said was Lauderdale shooting, right? They were discussing the fort and you heard some of that conversation, right? Eyes. Yes, eyes. 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 Yes, eyes. And some of the people who you said were there that day, Reince Priebus? He had been named the White House Chief of Staff in about November of 2016. Right? And you testified you saw Mike Pompeo standing around President Trump's desk that day, right? And he had been named as Secretary of State once President Trump took office, right? Eyes. And you testified that you saw Sean Spicer, right? Yes. And he became President Trump's press secretary, right? That's correct. And you said that you saw James Comey, right? Eyes. Who, at that time, was the FBI director, right? Yes. And so I just want to make sure that I understand the picture that you have of the meeting, everybody that I described as standing around President Trump's desk. Eyes. President Trump is seated? Yes, and Ms. Graff led you into an ongoing discussion of a domestic national security incident? AI was when Mr. Trump has a large office, and I was by the door while they were talking to Mr. Trump. But you overheard some of the conversation, you said? I didn't hear the words, but I heard just that the people were talking. And I think you said that there was a sort of a joke made by President Trump about you knowing more about the Fort Lauderdale situation than the other people in the room? I don't think he was referring to Fort Lauderdale, it a joke just saying that I knew more about all of information, that's all he was referring to as a joke. About okay, and you know that following that meeting, there's some issues between President Trump and Jim Comey, right? Objection. Mr. Steinglass, the court, sustained. Mr. Verbove, Your Honor, can we have a sidebar, please? The court, sure. Ask the court want to hear what the objection is. Mr. Steinglass, the relevance is. I'm finding it hard to see what Mr. Verbove want to lay a foundation so can we do this out of the presence of the witness, Judge? Court, is it possible to slide over this way? The court reporter, yes, Your Honor. Mr. Verbove intend to lay a foundation, Judge, that Mr. Pecker was well aware of events surrounding Mr. Comey. He was well aware of the subsequent investigations at issue and that connection with this investigation, Mr. Comey made emphatically clear that on January 26, 2017, was at Trump Tower with a classified briefing in an individual meeting in a conference room and not at his desk and that there was a very intense conversation. And the point of that cross is to illustrate that the witness has misremembered what he saw that day when he talked about Jim Comey because there was nothing to talk about regarding Fort Lauderdale. The court, that's an awful lot of information to bring out just to get to the point that he misremembered something. Mr. Bove, this witness is a critical witness, and his memory the court think you are doing a good job with his memory. I don't think you need to go there. The court, the objection is sustained. Mr. Bove, Mr. Bernick, can we just take a look at page 1213 of the transcript? And Mr. Bove, thank you, can you please zoom in? Think it's lines 21 through 24. And, Mr. Pecker, this is testimony that you gave of Mr. Steinglass, objection, Judge. I think this is being displayed, transcript being displayed to the jury here. This is the court, can you take that down, please? Please approach. The court, all right. Mr. Bove, I don't mean to run afoul of your rules, I have done that this morning already. The court, you did do that this morning already. I found it really unusual. There was no objection, so I allowed it, but there is an objection now. Mr. Bove, this is evidence, Judge. This is the transcript, why can't I receive it in and display it? H.